this video, I'm going to talk about the French rudiment known as a frisé. This is a rudiment based firmly in the French repertoire, the French tradition, and it can trace its history back quite a long way, and is a rudiment that I have become very interested in over the course of the last year or so, studying the snare drum as a solo instrument, and a rudiment that I have come to apply quite frequently in my own compositions. So in this video, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the rudiment as it exists in the French tradition, how it's applied, and some of the ways I've applied it in my own work, and look at some examples from the repertoire as well. The history of the frisé is quite difficult to trace because before around the mid-1800s, there is very little formally published literature on French drumming. There are examples, obscure military manuals and things like that, but it's not really until the late 1800s and the early 1900s that we start to see standardized and frequent mention of it in the published literature. We read in Robert Gut, for example, in his Tambour d'Ordonnance, his frustration at how such a crucial rudiment in the French tradition is glossed over by so many authors that come before him, and it's only until when we get to Alexandre Reynard, much later on, that we see a formally published reference to this rudiment. In that same book, in Gut's book, Tambour d'Ordonnance, we read a little bit about the history of this, with frequent mentions back to the mid-1800s. There's a famous piece in the French repertoire called Marché par Frisé, the curly march, I suppose, that is based around this rudiment, and it occurs in numerous forms throughout the piece. And there is reference to a French army regiment, the regiment of the gendarmerie, of the Guard, who were said to be specialists in this marching style, namely the frisé, as early as 1854. So we know that it dates back to at least then. However, with a little bit more digging, we find reference and usage to this rudiment far, far earlier. For example, there are traces of what we could call a frisé in André Philidor's work in 1704, 1705. So this rudiment goes back a long, long way, and it's considered by both Gut and Lefebvre of the author of Superior Technique that this is an integral part of the French repertoire. So it is a really interesting rudiment, and it is single strokes based. That means it is hand to hand. We alternate the sticking, and this is something that differentiates it from its American counterparts, because the frisé, as I'm talking about it today, involves numbered variations: a frisé of 3, a frisé of 4, a frisé of 5. And this obviously dictates how many strokes are in it, much like the American measured rolls, a 5-stroke roll, a 7-stroke roll, etc. And unlike the measured rolls of the American tradition, this is a single-stroke rudiment as opposed to a double-stroke rudiment. And that lends it a different air when performing it and listening to it. It sounds different and it feels different from the same figure played as double strokes. And this is a really interestingly French characteristic. Usually, but not always, the frisé appears as a note value double that of the surrounding subdivision. So if the surrounding subdivision is 8th notes, the frisé would typically appear as 16th notes. If the surrounding subdivision is 16th notes, it would typically appear as 32nd notes. And it can follow an accent, or it can precede an accent, what Lefebvre calls attacking or ending with an accent. If the phrase attacks with an accent, it begins with an accent. The first stroke of the figure is accented. If it ends with an accent, the figure ends with an accent, and it kind of emphasizes and leads up into that, which is again one of the crucial characteristics and primary applications of the frisé. So I'm going to begin with a very simple example in the time signature of 6/8. Essentially 2 principal beats to the bar with 3/8 notes per beat, 1 and 2 and. And for the purposes of this example, I'm going to place an accent on the final upbeat of the bar, 8th note number 6, 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and . So that's our basic figure, and we're going to apply the frisé on the second beat of the bar to lead into that final accent. So we're going to use a frisé of 5. This is a 5-stroke frisé, and in this particular iteration, that's going to be 4 16th notes, followed by the 5th stroke, which is the accented 8th note. You will hear very quickly how this works. It's a very, very, very simple rudiment to perform on a basic level. So the accent is on the last 8th note of the bar. with the Frisé. There's almost a crescendo effect, and this may be implied or it may be explicit, depending on the music and the composer. But the whole purpose here, the application, is to lead up and emphasize that accent. So there is this implied crescendo, even if it may not strictly be written in the music, although that's, of course, a performance point to look out for. But generally speaking, we get this speeding up effect from the double note value of the first strokes of the Frisé. And because it ends in the accent, everything seems to climax and crescendo towards that final accent. We can adjust the accent pattern slightly now to look at a slightly different variation. Staying with 6/8, we'll have an accent on both beats of the bar. 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a. And this time we will begin the Frisé straight away on the second eighth note, sticking with a Frisé of 5 to lead into, and again emphasize, the second accent. And we get this nice, again, speeding up effect that is a kind of breaking up of the main rhythm while staying strictly in time, which is, again, I consider to be a fundamentally French characteristic here. We can now look at an example that tackles the attacking element of the Frisé. This is where the Frisé begins with an accent. In this example, we will be in a traditional marching time, so we're in 2/4 here with an underlying note value of 16th notes. So our bass subdivision is 16th notes. And quite simply, we will have an accent on the second beat of the bar. 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a. And we are going to begin the accent, we're going to begin the Frisé on that second beat, beginning with the accent. So this is what Lefebvre calls attacking the accent. We begin the accent, we begin the Frisé on the accent, and then the Frisé kind of comes down from the accent. It's almost a reverse effect. So where we end with the accent, we lead up to the accent. When we begin the Frisé with the accent, we come down from it, and we get this decrescendo and decelerando effect. Again, these may be implied rather than explicit, but it's the rhythmic effect that this rudiment tends to have. Because of the way the Frisé is often applied, using the note value double that of the surrounding subdivisions, this can be quite easily and comfortably inserted into various tuplets as well. So in this example, I'm going to use a quintuplet, a 16th note quintuplet, so 5 16th notes to the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5. And quite simply, we will have an accent on the first note of that quintuplet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just as we did before, we're going to attack the accent. So we're going to begin the Frisé on the very first note of that quintuplet, beginning with the accent. Now, because this is 32nd notes into 16th notes, the first 4 notes of the Frisé are going to take up the first 2 16th notes of the quintuplet, leaving us 3 16th notes left over of that quintuplet. This will become clear as you hear it in context. So first of all, without the Frisé, and then with the Frisé included. Again, we can hear that implied decrescendo effect and this implied decelerando effect coming down from that accent. It's almost a deflation, and this can be quite powerful if you lead up to that accent and then come down again in this manner with an attacking Frisé. It's quite an interesting use of the Frisé here. Sticking with the quintuplets for now, we can move it along slightly so we end with the accent, taking that second variation, the ending with an accent. We will begin the Frisé on the second 16th note and end with an accent after it on the fifth 16th note of the quintuplet. So without the Frisé, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to begin the Frisé on the second stroke of that quintuplet. Quite a nice effect in there, and I love the way it breaks up the, not monotony, but the kind of droning sensation of those consistent 16th notes. It adds a nice rhythmic kick into there, which is really interesting and quite fun to play as well. Moving on, we can apply a very simple 7-stroke Frisé, a Frisé of 7 in much the same way. I won't labour this point because the application is becoming clear here. It's just a longer Frisé, like the American 7-stroke roll. It's 7 strokes, beginning with or ending with an accent. So in this example, like we did a moment ago, stick with 2/4, an accent on the second beat of the bar, 1 E under, 2 E under. I'm going to begin the Frisé on the second 16th note of the first beat and carry it on for 6 strokes, culminating in the 7th stroke, which is the accented second beat. Nice and snappy. I really like that one. It's quite interesting to perform because it's an alternating single stroke, which is kind of unexpected. We usually expect paradiddles or double strokes to flick our hands around, but depending on which 16th note we begin the 32nd note Frisé, it can have the effect of flipping our hands. So you saw that was an alternating pattern there. Really interesting example. Finally, just to close the point, we will attack. So we begin with the Frisé. I'll stick with the accent in the same place. The Frisé is going to begin with the accent, I should say. So the accent is on the second beat of the bar, 1 E under, 2 E under, and quite simply I'm going to begin that accent on the first note of the Frisé. Similar sort of thing, nice and snappy effect within what is an otherwise very simple measure. Now, we move on to one of my favourite examples here, the Frisé of 3. This is a version of the rudiment that I've used an awful lot in my own compositions. And as before, it can attack, begin with an accent, or it can lead into, end with an accent. For our simple purposes here, we are thinking in terms of 16th notes, in which case the Frisé would be 2 32nd notes followed by a 16th note. So within a simple figure just on its own, or attacking, very simple 3-stroke figure, but how it is employed can be very, very interesting and make for some really interesting figures. So beginning with a single stroke figure, 1 E under, 2 E under. Very simply, I'm going to begin every beat of the bar, the 1, the 2, with a Frisé. Everything else will remain as 16th notes. Now in this example, I'm attacking the accent. So the Frisé is beginning with an accent and it itself acts as an accent. So perhaps if we played the same figure without the Frisé, we would just very simply have an accent on the beat. Now, sticking with the same accent figure on the beat, but if we end the Frisé with the accent, we will actually begin the Frisé on the 4th 16th note, 1 E and so that we lead into and end with the accent on the beat. again, we get this nice snappy lead up into an accent. Personally, I find that less interesting than the attacking version. I find the attacking version really interesting because it essentially acts as an accent in and of itself and can be applied in some really rhythmic ways. So this time, I will apply the Frisé as a dotted eighth note figure. In other words, I'm going to apply it every 3 16th notes. So it's acting as a dotted eighth note across that 16th note bar. If I play the figure first of all as accents, it sounds like that. Now notice, or keep in mind, we are still actually in 4/4 here, or 2/4 here, 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a, 4E and a. I think that's a really interesting way to play because it acts as the accent. There's a lot of quite original and interesting things that you can do it with. So let's say you have a simple clave, 16th notes accenting the clave rhythm. We insert the Frisé figure on every accent and itself acting as the accent. Can make for some really interesting rhythmic jumps within your otherwise pretty typical figure. Your typical accent figures can be made to be a little bit more interesting and French by the application of these Frisé. Again, because of the note value, the way it works as the note value, one instance of this 32nd note Frisé essentially takes up 1/16th note of the measure. So even though we count it as a Frisé of 3 with the note coming after it counted as the third stroke, the actual 2 32nd notes themselves count as 1/16th note. So this means it can be once again applied within tuplets very, very simply. So sticking with the quintuplets as we did previously, if we have an accented quintuplet roll, we can very simply convert that accent into a Frisé of 3, giving our quintuplet quite a nice rhythmic jolt at the beginning. We can do this with quintuplet figures with 2 accents in them. And again, we get that nice rhythmic kick. This is something that Joe Tompkins used a lot in his various volumes of French-American rudimental solos to great effect. It's a really interesting way of giving extra rhythmic decoration to a tuplet. Sticking with this theme now and extending outwards to a Frisé of 4, another one of my personal favourites. This variation, not necessarily, but typically occurs as a tuplet, specifically a triplet. So if we're in 16th notes, we can apply the first 3 strokes of this Frisé of 4 as 32nd note triplets. So just as the Frisé of 3 a moment ago, one iteration of this Frisé occupies 1/16th note of the measure. So if we have an accented 16th note roll accenting on the beat, we can attack that accent beginning the 32nd note triplet Frisé with that accent. Which gives us, once again, a really nice rhythmic kick. Now, if we wanted to invert that and use the accent at the end of the figure, we would once again begin the Frisé on the 4th 16th note of every beat. So we're ending the Frisé with the accent, crescendoing up, leading into that accent. So I will play those versions next to each other. So it's a really fun way to play. It's a really French-sounding way to play the drums. I know it's a very, very simple figure, but incorporating those 30-second note frises as triplets, it flows so nicely because it keeps the sticking the same. If we're playing a right-handed single-stroke roll, right, left, converting that first 16th note to a triplet maintains that sticking because you play it right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. So it doesn't actually alter the sticking. So it's really quite a simple way to start incorporating this into your existing accent figures. Just like we did with the Frisé of 3, we can create some really interesting figures by adopting it as an eighth note, a dotted eighth note figure throughout the bar. So going back to what we had previously, we get this nice dotted eighth note effect traversing through our bar of 4/4. And I love it. I can't say more than that. It just sounds so snappy and interesting to listen to and fun to play simply by treating that Frisé of 4 as 30-second note triplets as a sort of accent point within the figure, within your measure. Now, so far, I have been considering the open version of the Frisé. By open, I mean two things. First of all, every stroke is individually articulated, so there is no kind of rebound or bounce or buzz going on. I'm responsible for playing all of those strokes. Secondly, every stroke of the Frisé is metered. That means within the measure, within the figure, it possesses a rhythmic value. It has a note value. So these are not written as grace notes. These are written as normal notes, and they exist within the bar. So when we play the Frisé of 4 as a 30-second note triplet, that triplet has the value of 1/16th note within that measure. This is an open application of the rudiment, and it's just the same in the American tradition. Open drags or open roughs, they are metered within the bar. However, the Frisé also exists historically in a lot of the repertoire as a closed variation. So this is acciaccatura played as written as grace notes, where it does not possess a rhythmic meter. It is not metered within the bar. It does not possess a rhythmic value. And it is applied in much the same way as closed drags and roughs of other traditions. A closed drag in that sense, in the traditional sense, does not feature a note value. It's kind of attached to the accent that comes after it. So in just the same way, we can think of that figure as just being 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, depending on how fast I'm capable of playing it, we could make an argument that it exists as a 32nd note or a 64th note or a 128th note, but for all intents and purposes, I am treating that Frisé as existing immediately before the accent itself. That's just inserting a closed Frisé into a simple accent figure, and you can hear that I am voicing the 4th 16th note of that figure, 1 E and 2 E and the Frisé is occurring in its closed form between those two 16th notes, but not halfway in between, as close to the accent as I can get it. When we do the Frisé of 4 in that way, it's quite difficult. You've got to fit in an extra note, so it's a little bit of a tongue twister, so to speak, on the fingers. It's quite tricky, but it gives you this really kind of aggressive effect, really leads into that accent strongly. Now, in Lefebvre, in Superior Technique, we find a really interesting example here of applying a closed Frisé within an open double stroke roll. And this is something I've not seen anywhere else. I've not seen it in any other method books, or I've not seen it in any other solos or anything like that. This is a really interesting figure. And essentially, the example in Lefebvre is a 5-stroke open roll. So in the American rudimental tradition, we would just call it an open 5-stroke roll, 4 double strokes and an accent. And because this is open, those double strokes are metered. So in this example, they are 30-second notes. 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. Now in the Lefebvre example, a closed Frisé of 3 is inserted immediately before the accent, but immediately after the last stroke of the double. So very, very slowly. Remember, because this is a closed iteration, the first two notes of that Frisé cannot displace the accent. That accent still has to be in its original position on the beat. Quite tough. It really relies on a bit of intricate finger control to get it in there, and I'm not sure practically how much faster you could take it while still retaining any degree of sort of rhythmic articulation. But it gives, again, what I would consider to be a characteristically French kick to an otherwise pretty standard rhythm. It's very cool, very interesting, and I was really happy to discover it in the Lefebvre book. Now we come to an example, again, in Lefebvre, that combines 3 iterations of everything we've talked about so far. This combines an attacking open Frisé, an open ending Frisé where the accent comes at the end, and an attacking closed Frisé, all to do with 16th note triplets. So in the first example, we're just in accented 16th note triplets. 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a. An accented triplet roll, essentially. And the Frisé is applied as an open Frisé of 3 on the accent. Sounds similar to the dotted 8th note pattern we did earlier, except this time we are specifically in a triplet subdivision. The second example moves the accent along 1, so the accent is on the upbeat in the middle of the triplet, 1 and a 2 and a. And the Frisé begins on the first note of that triplet, so it ends with the accent crescendoing up into it. Finally, going back to the accent on the beat itself, on the first note of the triplet, we can apply a closed Frisé leading into that. So it's an ending Frisé. The accent comes at the end, but it's closed. So it occurs just before the accent itself. And I really love that aggressive kick that it gives to the accent you're playing. It's a really fun way to play. So I just want to close with a few examples from the repertoire. I'm going to begin with one of my favourite examples from Joe Tompkins' work. Joe and I have collaborated recently on some of my own material. He's really lent me his guidance and his expertise on some of my own compositions. And one of the things we discussed was the use of the Frisé and how I've been applying it and how it can be applied. There is a wonderful, elegant example from his Etude number 1, solo number 1, from his second volume of French-American rudimental solos. And it's in 2/4. And it is essentially a 16th note sextuplet with an accent every 3 strokes. One and a 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 1 and a 2 and a. And this example is so brilliant because it combines both attacking and ending Frisé. So the very first accent of the sextuplet itself becomes an open, attacking Frisé of 3. Next, we have the middle accent. And then, following that middle accent, we begin with a Frisé of 5, ending in the accent on the second beat. Beautiful example of how this vocabulary can be employed in really simple yet elegant ways. So that's a great example from Joe Tompkins. Next, I want to have a look at one of my own applications. This is from my own piece called Jatapath, and in this figure, or in this passage, I employ numerous iterations of a Frisé of 3. And I apply it both as 32nd notes and as 64th notes. And the 64th note application gives a really short, snappy, it's almost like a flam. It feels slightly different than a flam, but it's almost acting in the same way as a flam, giving this short, sharp emphasis to a rhythmic point. So the figure sounds like this. The passage runs like this. And any instance of the is that Frisé at work. Here's the passage again. So we've got 2 quintuplets at the beginning. They are actually 32nd note quintuplets, beginning with a 64th note Frisé. And the second quintuplet and the second Frisé is the accent. So the actual figure, if we remove all of the subdivisions in the Frisé, is just 1 and 1 and. And we're decorating that accent pattern not only with the quintuplets, but with a Frisé within those quintuplets. Later on in the piece, we have another example of a 64th note Frisé, this time beginning a short figure which accumulates in a 32nd note accent at the end of the figure. It sounds like this. It's a very short, sharp beginning to a phrase. You can hear it in there. Those first 2... That's the Frisé of 3, produced as 64th notes. So the whole figure again. And it goes on from there. You can hear those Frisé occurring within that passage, hopefully. Next, another one of my own examples taken from the piece Numinous Measure. So I won't go too far into the theory behind this, but we're in 15/16, and this is essentially felt as 3 quintuplets to the bar: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, there are instances of 32nd note Frisé in a 16th note subdivision and 64th note Frisé within a 32nd note subdivision. So first of all, the passage sounds like this. There is actually a 32nd note triplet Frisé of 4 in there in the 3rd bar as well. Here it is again. You can hear in the 3rd bar there, if I slow that right down, that triplet is a Frisé of 4 that is open. So that does exist as the final 16th note of that beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of the other examples of Frisé in that passage are actually attacking Frisé, so they all begin with and act as accents themselves. It's a really fun way to use them, I found, and I've really enjoyed applying them. One more from my own example, from my own repertoire. This is from the piece entitled Decatria. And this is a long and meandering passage, so I won't play the whole thing. But the passage itself contains 32nd note Frisé within a 16th note subdivision. And what's interesting about this one is the juxtaposition between 32nd note Frisé of 3 and 32nd note triplet Frisé of 4. So the passage runs like this. And you can hear there's essentially an underlying 16th note flow. And the accents and the use of the Frisé serve to decorate and add a sense of urgency to that. Here it is again. Let's take that a bit faster now. It's a fun one to play. It's quite tricky. Again, a little bit of a tongue twister in the hands, but it's a really nice way to apply a sense of urgency and energy to your figures. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned something of interest about the Frisé itself, and this has encouraged you to check out the repertoire for some further reading. I would strongly encourage you to look at Robert Gut's work, the Tambour d'Ordonnance. There are 3 volumes. The volume there might be more actually, 4 or 5 volumes, I'm not sure now. But the volume I was specifically referencing today was volume 3, in which the Marché par Frisé exists, and his writings and his thoughts about the Frisé itself. Guy Lefebvre's Superior Technique. There are a lot of exercises about the Frisé itself and some fantastic examples. And of course, Joe Tompkins' French-American Rudimental Solos. All 3 volumes are fantastic, and you will find a lot of these Frisé applications in there. And of course, for those of you interested, there are many examples throughout my own compositions as well. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.